Join with me in our prayer of preparation. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Life is ordinary. That's what we see when we step back and look at our lives. We wake up each day, we get ready for the day, we eat, we work, we play, we sleep, and we do it all again. This is the ordinariness of life. We create habits, we develop routines and live them each day. But when it comes to Easter, we see that maybe life is not as ordinary as we may think. Perhaps the extraordinary is all around us, waiting to be seen and experienced. When we look at the life of Jesus, we see something that seems extraordinary. The Bible claims that Jesus healed sick people and that he taught with authority as though he knew God personally. It also says that he fought against the established religious order, not with weapons or with an army, but with love. The life of Christ was definitely not ordinary. But then Jesus comes up against the religious leaders in Jerusalem. He doesn't slow down because of them. In fact, his actions were probably seen as even more extreme than what had come before them. Jesus went into the courtyard of the temple, which is the most sacred building to the Jewish people, and he flipped the tables of those who were selling things there. He made a whip and drove all their animals for sale out of the area. He ruined their business for the day. He messed with their traditions, and for that, they wanted him dead. So late on at night on a Thursday, a crowd is sent from the high priest to where Jesus and his disciples are staying. The disciples flee in panic, and Jesus is arrested. Just a few hours later, early on Friday, all the religious leaders are gathered to put Jesus on trial. They quickly come to the conclusion that he is guilty and that his punishment should be death. Jesus is taken to Pilate, the Roman governor, so that he can give the final sentence. But Pilate hesitates. The crowd shouts for Jesus to be crucified, though, and that's what happens. Jesus, despite all the good he did in the world, despite the hope he brought to the world, is put to death. Most of the people who cared about Jesus had fled. They remained hidden as Jesus died on that cross. But there were a few people who were brave enough that they came and got Jesus' body. They wrapped him in cloth and closed the tomb with a giant rock. This extraordinary man, who claimed to be God, was dead. I've had an encounter with death that I want to tell you about. A few years ago, I was down in Ocean City, Maryland with a group of young people. We were out together for dinner at a restaurant on Saturday evening when I got a phone call. My brother was calling, and since I was in the middle of a conversation, I decided to silence my phone. About 30 seconds later, Emily, my wife, got a call. It was my brother calling her now. She answered and immediately handed me the phone. I could tell in an instant that this was important. As I walked outside to have a private conversation with my brother, I was told some disturbing news. My father had just been taken to the hospital. The only other news we had was that the reason for the trip to the hospital was that my father had sustained a heart attack. As I hung up the phone, I was stunned. I loved my father. I still needed my father, and the children I planned to have needed their grandfather. If any of you have ever had a similar experience, you'll know what I mean when I say I slept terribly that night. I'm not sure you can even call that sleep. All I could think about was my father, questions about life and death, thoughts of missed opportunities with my dad. On Sunday morning, we drove up to my mom and dad's house in Rochester, New York. That evening we arrived and I met with my mother, my 2 older brothers, and my younger sister. They told us my father was in an induced coma and that the doctors had no idea whether there was any brain function left in his body. We talked more and prayed. It wouldn't be until Monday that I would get to see my father's body. Another restless night of sleep finally brought me to the hospital on Monday morning. We crowded into a small room, and as we touched my father's hands, we noticed how cold he was. His body temperature had been lowered several degrees to possibly save brain function. Then we did the only thing we could. We waited. Finally, the doctors decided it was time to raise his body temperature, and after several hours with many pensive moments and tears as we considered the odds we faced, we had our first glimmer of hope. My dad opened his eyes. On Tuesday, we had a similar moment, only this time there was movement, and my dad was clearly surprised to see us there. Later that day, the doctor asked him if he recognized each one of us. First, my oldest brother Andy and my dad confirmed it with a head nod. Then Richard, then me and my wife, then my sister with a yes to each one of us. Then finally the doctor asked about my mother, and my dad smiled and shook his head no. We knew in that moment that my father was back. He was back from the dead. Later, we learned the circumstances of his hospitalization. My mom and sister, who lived with my dad, decided to go to a movie theater the day of the heart attack. My dad said that after he left, he felt funny, so he decided to go for a walk. That single decision saved his life. As he walked, he had chest pain and collapsed in front of a neighbor's home, a neighbor who happened to be an off-duty EMT. Another neighbor also saw what happened and immediately dialed 911. My father's heart was stopped for at least 7 minutes. But because the EMT was there to do compressions, he was eligible to undergo state-of-the-art therapeutic hypothermia at the best hospital in the region for heart attacks. My family is forever grateful to the man who saved my father's life and the doctors who brought him back from death. My dad was saved by modern medicine. That is something truly extraordinary. But in Jesus Christ, we see something that goes well beyond extraordinary. Jesus' heart was not stopped for 7 minutes. It was stopped for 3 days. Jesus did not have an EMT to keep his heart going. He didn't have doctors to cool his body or revive him. Jesus was dead, witnessed by the soldiers at the cross, confirmed by those who cared for his body and laid him in the tomb. Now this much makes sense to us. We understand death, but when we talk about Sunday, about a dead man raising from the grave, suddenly we are talking about something that makes no sense. The disciple Thomas said, "Unless I see it with my own eyes, I won't believe it." Throughout history, people have tried to rationalize what happened by saying it's a lie or an exaggeration or a nice story. But when you consider the world around us, how a star can bend light, or that the universe was at one time probably the size of a pinhead, we begin to see that extraordinary things, sometimes unbelievable things, are all around us. It is no harder to believe these declarations of science than it is to believe that the God of the universe raised a dead man to life to vindicate his claim that he is the Son of God. And in this resurrection, we see a dramatic sign of God's victory over all the forces of evil in this world. The resurrection is God's sign of victory over death. It signals that sin, evil, and death will not have the final word. Resurrection confirms that Jesus is in fact God's Son. It confirms Jesus' claim that he is the resurrection and that even though people die, in him they live. It confirms that Jesus' death had a divine purpose, that Jesus' death brings forgiveness of sins, and that this good news should be shared with the whole world, from Jerusalem to Judea to the ends of the earth. When Jesus beat death, he showed us that there is hope. Death does not have the last word. Pain and suffering are not the last claim on our lives. There is more to life, and we know it because Jesus proved it. Frederick Buechner, a famous author and minister, is known for a phrase that I think sums up the meaning of the resurrection. He says, resurrection means the worst thing is never the last thing. Because of Christ, we know that something good is ahead of us. We know that fear and hate and death have no claim on us because we serve a God that can beat these things. Let me share just one last thing with you. There was a family, a husband and a wife, who tried desperately to have children. They tried for many years until finally, one day, the miracle happened. They gave birth to a little girl, a fulfillment of their hopes for so long. Then just a few months later, the father was diagnosed with a rare but very aggressive form of cancer. His pastor was there at his bedside as the illness took over his body. He had a remarkable faith in the midst of such suffering and pain. He said this, "I know God doesn't give his children cancer. This is simply a part of life. Of course I'm praying to be made well. That is my desire. But even more than my own healing, I am praying that somehow, in the midst of my battle with cancer, the glory of God might be revealed in my life." He went on, "I know that Christ is risen, and because he lives, I will live. I know he has prepared a place for me. I am not afraid, and I trust that he will send people to care for my wife and my little girl. Like Paul, if I live longer, I will be grateful for that and hope to be useful to him. But if the cancer runs its natural course, I know I will be with him. And I am grateful for that. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." This Easter, we see something extraordinary. Not only the world around us that is so incredible, not just the testimonies of those among us who have their own resurrection stories like my father, but we see that Christ has triumphed over death, that we are forgiven, and sin does not have a hold on our lives any longer. Christ's resurrection changes the world around us so that in the ordinary, we can see the extraordinary action of God. In 24 hours, Jesus changed the whole world. And now we know for certain, death is not the end. The best is yet to come. Amen? Amen. Amen. I invite you now, let's stand for our final song.